Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for today's panel discussion, Women of Influence, Pioneers, and Changemakers, presented by the Women of SIGGRAPH. The mission of the Women of SIGGRAPH is to connect, empower, and develop women in computer graphics and interactive techniques by providing opportunities for professional advancement and promoting community. Our panelists today are Maxine Brown, who's a SIGGRAPH pioneer and the chair of the ACM SIGGRAPH 92 conference. She's also the retired director of the Electronic Visualization Lab at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Rebecca Strzelec is Associate Dean for Academic Programs at the Stamps School of Art and Design at the University of Michigan, and Rebecca was also the SIGGRAPH 2012 conference chair. Maureen Stone is retired as the Director of Research at Tableau and was the Technical Paper Chair at SIGGRAPH 87 and the Editor-in-Chief of IEEE Computer Graphics and Applications from 2007 to 2010. Mary Whitton is Research Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, was the past chair of the ACM SIGGRAPH Executive Committee and is currently chair of the SIGGRAPH History Committee. And I'm your host, Adele Newton. I chair the SIGGRAPH Communications Committee, and I also was the SIGGRAPH 88 conference co-chair. This event is brought to you by our sponsors, Autodesk and Foundry. So the last time we had this conversation was way back in March 2020, when we were deep in the hold of a pandemic and everything was done by Zoom or email. And luckily we're not doing that anymore and we can see each other in person, at least some of us next week at SIGGRAPH. But I wanted to ask, how did the pandemic change the way you worked and how did you incorporate that change into your life so far? And I'm going to start with Maxine because you're at the top of my screen.
Okay. Well, the pandemic gave me impetus to retire. A lot of the work I did was face-to-face with the people I worked with, and without a face-to-face, it was hard getting information over Zoom. So I decided to retire, but after 34 years at the University of Illinois Chicago's Electronic Visualization Lab, plus another dozen years in industry, I just couldn't drop out. I mean, I've made a lot of friends in the computer graphics world, the visualization world, and then we got into international networking infrastructure. And these friends became family. These were communities that I've known 30, 40, or almost 50 years. So I now, UIC does hire me back part-time to work on a specific grant, but I volunteer just to pay back all the groups that have been good to me and really help my career be successful. And in fact, I've been spending a lot of time on the SIGGRAPH History Committee this past year, sending them information, and I'm on a couple panels in 2 weeks. So but luckily, because I am retired, I have more time just to devote to hobbies and friends and culture and things that I could never do when I was working round the clock.
And gratefully, you don't have to do it over Zoom now anymore. You can like this if we need to, but you don't have to.
Right.
Which is the best part. I'm afraid I kind of am failing at retirement too. Maureen, what about you? Because you're retired too.
Well, I'm retired now. I retired in June of 2022. So when the pandemic shut us all down and sent us home from the office, I was still managing a group of 8 to 10 people and of researchers in Tableau research, doing primarily visualization work, some data science as well. And we had to switch to using Zoom or Google Meet for meetings. It was surprisingly undifficult. It was, we were a distributed team anyway. We had members down in Palo Alto as well as in Seattle. So, and we were, one of the realities of open office situations is that you primarily communicate even with your neighbors via Slack, or because it's rude to go talk to people and make noise in that office where everybody's trying to, open space where everybody's trying to concentrate. And then you'd have to like reserve a conference room to get everyone together. And with Google Meet, you just book it. You don't need a conference room. It was really quite lovely. The other thing was that I've got a fairly noticeable commute from where we live in Woodinville into Seattle. And boy, did I love losing that commute. Suddenly people could call 8:30, 9 o'clock meetings. I just have to roll out, be decent from the shoulders up, and and not that I ever wore anything too shocking below, but it was much different than getting dressed for the entire day and getting in the car and driving the rush hour traffic and all of that. The other interesting thing was that with remote friends, we suddenly realized we could Zoom. I don't have to wait till I go down to Palo Alto to talk to my friends and still see their faces, because I'm not a phone person. So yes, the pandemic has, made a huge amount of changes, many of which are negative to my effect, about meeting in crowds and being able to go to places. And I'm still one of the people that wear a mask in public indoors because it's not gone yet, folks. And so and I keep seeing friends, good friends, get very sick, even ones who have been careful and vaccinated. And so that part's pretty terrible, but it will be fun to get together in SIGGRAPH, and I'll show you my lovely rainbow masks. And but in terms of intellectual content, and the intellectual interactions among a group of people who are primarily heads down in their own research, but also touching base for community, it wasn't that big of a deal to switch to online meetings.
I love hearing that community was not just maintained, but has continued throughout after we were allowed to get back together again. Now, Rebecca, you're starting a whole new part of your life, a whole new journey a lot just after the pandemic. So tell us about how things have worked out for you.
Oh, I mean, things have worked out gloriously. I mean, I've moved from central Pennsylvania to Ann Arbor, Michigan this week to start a new job at the University of Michigan. And it's funny, like, you never know where you're going to land, but in the darkest part, the deepest, darkest part of the pandemic, I was like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. Like, I remember calling my retirement person and being like, how soon can I retire? I don't care how little money it is. I just need to know like the day, because I needed a countdown in order to like get through it. It's so hard to teach visual arts to young adults like this, having had no training or build up, I'm not the only, all teachers of all kinds went through this, but especially the ones where there's lots of demonstration and like where you physically like go over to a student and say, no, try it like this. That's very difficult to kind of facilitate online. But my colleagues and I found really kind of scrappy, cool ways to reach them that we then like took into our studios once we returned, which was great. So like in bigger rooms, we now use like cameras and things to show everyone what we're doing in very small spaces. Like we hadn't really treated our art making studios like that. So I think we took a lot with us. And then like, I'm excited, like right now, I'm so excited for my new position and my job and all the possibilities that's gonna have. They know they're all gonna unfold at Stamps at the University of Michigan. And so like, I couldn't have imagined a more different and exciting scenario for myself, feeling so stuck and so isolated too, so incredibly excited about to like embark on like as close to a dream job as I could possibly have. So like in a way, it's almost like that was my bottom, like that I had to get there in order to kind of rebound into something really exciting. And if it does get to a point again where I feel like, to be safe for my family and my community, we are isolating in that kind of a way, I'll feel much more prepared, and I will know kind of how that affects me personally And then as a mother too, I think we lose sight of that a lot, keeping these two smaller humans alive with my husband. It's not just our emotions and our well-being and how we're feeling, but they're grappling with like missing their friends and the community they built at school for so long. So that all impacted it as well. But I'm very excited. I'm very excited. Like Maureen said, like, it's still here, folks. Like, I'm excited to be in a place where they acknowledge, like, everywhere I turn in Ann Arbor, everyone's acknowledging that COVID is still present and that there's all kinds of other things, community support, that are just built into the kind of fibers of this place. And I'm really excited about it. So
That's so great. Congratulations on the new
thank
job.
you. Thank you so
And
much.
thanks for speaking with us on a day when I'm sure you're surrounded by
Yeah,
boxes.
I'm not going to pan out. There's so like, if I can tell you how many boxes I'm surrounded, like I'm like pinned in between boxes, but
well, we can't help you with that on Zoom.
No, and you don't want, I promise you don't want to. And near the end, the packing was just more like emptying drawers. So you don't want to be a part of this, I promise. Yeah.
Mary, you and I got to spend a lot of time together over Zoom throughout the pandemic. So I think I even know the answer to this, but how did things change for you and how have you incorporated those changes?
I think one of the things was that realizing that my interaction with my colleagues had to supply me with intellectual stimulation and also social stimulation. Because if you're not going in, I mean, when going to the grocery store is your big outing for a month, you need some time with some folks. And I lucked into starting a collaboration with a former PhD student who had worked with someone at Virginia Tech, and she joined us. He was in Melbourne. She was moving to Meta in Seattle, and I was in North Carolina. I never met her from March 2020 to March 2023 when at the VR conference. So that was kind of cool. We recognized it was important for us to plan time to just talk to each other in addition to doing research. And sometimes we would get on the phone and say, I hadn't done anything. Let's just talk. And it was just incredibly good for us to have that community of three. And we've been meeting every third week or so for 3+ years now. I think it's particularly important on Zoom. You have to have good meeting habits. You got to listen, you got to be respectful, all those things that we are taught. But it kind of is worse because you can't go follow up and it's not as easy to apologize. COVID and retirement kind of hit me both at the same time. So it really actually changed the character of the work, that we're not doing work that requires graduate students, that requires user studies, that we had to do things that 3 of us in 3 different places could work on separately. The 3 of us have done a think piece, a workshop piece, and an opinion piece. So those are all things that don't require other people to do them. And I don't know if anyone else has noticed, there's been a real uptick in the number of survey papers we've been asked to review since COVID, because it's something people could just buckle down and do, them and the internet. And I think this applies to any remote collaboration, not just COVID, especially if you don't know people very well. Everything's harder remotely. So I think even then it's important to choose your colleagues and your research topics very, very carefully.
Well, the theme I'm hearing, and it's no surprise, is the importance of community. I think we took it for granted maybe before we didn't have community, or community was harder to establish in real life. I know for me, towards the end of COVID, there was a gum commercial, like a commercial for gum that came on that showed people coming together and hugging, and it would make me cry every time. And I thought, okay, you are really losing it. But it was just because when you don't see people and you're isolated, and as you say, the trip to the grocery store is your big outing for the month, then it's hard. And one of the things that I know that SIGGRAPH gives us, and this is a nice microcosm, is community. And one of the things that we were all happy to get back to last year was the in-person conference. So I wanted to ask about, as we approach the 50th anniversary next week, which is really hard for me to believe. I was looking back at past conference things for a panel I'm preparing for, and I'm looking at like the 10th conference. I was there for that. How could it be the 50th already, but there it is. Can you talk about the role of SIGGRAPH in your career and your personal life? And Max, you started off by saying that a lot of the people that you know have become friends and family. They're not just colleagues. So do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. And I think in the last panel we did, I talked about mentors from high school to college to grad school that really helped steer my career. And I'm, I am in touch with many of them, and they have become lifelong friends. But specifically about the role of SIGGRAPH in my career, once I had my first job, it was at Hewlett-Packard in the Bay Area. And that's how I got hooked up with SIGGRAPH 77 in San Jose. But every job I've taken since, Jim George, who was my mentor from the SIGGRAPH early years, he has directed me or recommended me or given me counsel on whether or not I should take the job. So after Hewlett-Packard, I was there 3 years. It's a large company, hardware oriented, not a lot of computer graphics, and I wanted software, computer graphics, and small company. And there was one exhibitor at SIGGRAPH and ISCO in San Diego. And Jim George, I was co-chair with Jim and Steve Levine of the exhibits that year in '79, but he had a working relationship with the president of ISCO, Peter Preuss, introduced me. And within a few months, I applied for a job there and I was hired. And they said, oh, you can write. You're going to write a technical manual. Sure, what's that? I had no idea. And I did. And then after that, they said, you're a really good communicator. How about you start writing press releases? Okay, what's that? And so they had hired a PR company, but they needed a liaison between the PR company and internally that could explain there's something new happening and this is what it's about. So I was the translator from the tech to more higher level. And after that, after 3 years there, I got a phone call from Gary Demos, who had just started a company with John Whitney Jr. called Digital Productions. Demos and Whitney Jr. had previously worked for Information International Incorporated, and they had done a lot of demos at SIGGRAPH, and they worked on Tron. And Gary said, hey, Jim George recommended you. We need a director of documentation. Okay. I was ecstatic that Hollywood called. And I went there. They weren't quite ready for documentation. They were writing code for a supercomputer very quickly. They had no visualization software. So they were writing it and they couldn't stop to explain it or for me to document it. But I said, I'm going to consult in the area, and if you need me, I'll come back. And they did call me up, and I did go back, and I did write their manuals. And shortly after a couple of years of consulting, Tom Defani, I told him my industry, a lot of companies were either acquired or going out of business in '86. And so he offered me a job in Chicago. So I called Jim George, and he said, even though I knew Tom for 11 years, I wanted his opinion. And he said that Tom's a good guy, and I really like the way he works with his students. So I took the job. And when I called my parents to tell them I was moving from Los Angeles to Chicago for a new job, first thing my father said is, and what did Jim George say? So my parents figured this out. Anyway, that as far as family, pictures is a universal language. And I started framing posters and prints of artwork from SIGGRAPH. And my mother wanted one, and friends would come visit. Oh, what's that? And so my career was never scary to them or too technical for them, because pictures is a universal language.
I
So,
remember your
anyway.
apartment in Chicago had walls and walls and walls of pictures and graphics. I recall that very well.
So,
It's a
I
good looking
still
wall
have
of
'em, but
pictures
they're not
behind you
all
right
up.
now.
That's a great one behind you.
Yeah, I have a few back here. So anyway, that's as I can't believe yes, my first conference was the third one of SIGGRAPH. So
Wow.
but when I hear 50 years old, I don't believe it for any of us.
It's true. Rebecca, you weren't at the first or the third or even the 10th probably. So
No.
you haven't been around as long as some of us, but what has been the role of SIGGRAPH in your career?
I mean, SIGGRAPH in part allowed me to earn tenure at Penn State. It allowed me and my work to be seen internationally, having exhibited at the SIGGRAPH art galleries a couple times, but then working alongside of artists I would meet and collaborate with. I've written papers with people I've met. And then, I mean, truth be told, to bring it back to University of Michigan again, I've met dear friends like Ilona Van Gent, who is a professor at University of Michigan. And I got to hear about that program for decades, about all the great things they were doing there. And I remember like saying to her, I'm like, I'll just take your job when you retire. And it was always such a funny inside joke, but I felt like part of that circle of people because I got to hear about kind of their reorganization, all the exciting things they were doing, and kind of hear it from a first person perspective, from a person I trusted. So when this job started to look like it might be a possibility, it felt very comfortable because I wasn't going to have a ton of surprises because I kind of knew the place, but also very dear friends, like people I still go and visit, lifelong friends on both the attendee side, so people that are also attending the conferences and the researchers and the artists, but also, you know, as a conference chair, and I think everyone here that's been in that position or close to it will know that our relationship with what we call the contractors, or the people that are paid to work on SIGGRAPH, not the volunteers, there's something uniquely special about them. In all the other organizations I've ever volunteered for, people are wonderful and they do the job well, but there's something different about the contractors who work on SIGGRAPH. And because of that, I'm still really close. Like when life things happen to me, like I text Cindy Stark because she's like
Don't we all?
one of my best friends. And I like when things happen to her, like I cry for her, and I like it's she's really, really important to me. And I would have never met her. There would be no reason to have met her. And so, and then, you know, you think about people like Jackie White, of course, and how many of us were logging into her funeral so we could say goodbye to her because she's such an important, she was my mentor. Like I would call her when things would, you know, get under my skin and I'd be like, what am I supposed to do? And she would pull out an email from like 1989 and be like, well, there's precedent. This is how you do it. And I mean, she's her whole life. She dedicated so much of her professional life to this organization and conference. And so like, I think in a way, as one of the younger people on the call, I think my first conference was 2003. So I'm not that young, right? But I came into it in a place where it was like, you know, plateauing off from its heyday. And then we had some financial difficulties. So in addition to the emotional family friendships that have been forged, I also cannot imagine as a visual artist getting the kind of chops I got with public relations, budget management, contract negotiations, team management, dynamics of working with a team of diverse partners. Like, yes, I had bits and pieces of that at Penn State University and as an art professor, but being in the room with some of these folks and the brains they have really allowed me to really kind of round out who I am as a thinker and a maker. And now as an administrator, as an associate dean, like I have a very interesting kind of faceted experience because of the things I got to be a part of with SIGGRAPH on both the contributor, attendee, volunteer, but also the conference chair side. Like I wouldn't take any of that back. Like I am so lucky to have gotten to be in those rooms and see and do the things I got to do.
So true.
Yeah.
I'm going to mix things up a little bit because both Maxine and Rebecca have brought this up, and I know we wanted this to be sort of core to the conversation, and that's about the importance of mentors. And both of you talked about, just how deeply important, Jim in your case, Maxine, and Jackie in your case, Rebecca, but also whether we know it or like it or not, we are mentors. And many of you, I can look at Maxine, who I first met when my son, who turns 42 this year, was still in diapers. So long ago. And Mary, not much later than that. And Maureen, you and I go back a long way too. And I consider you all to be mentors. And the importance of that, not just in our careers, but also just our lives, our daily lives. And Mary, you as a professor would have had that experience too. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think it's different for people who are in the workforce now and those of us who are retired. And if you're in the workforce, it's important to know what you're good at and how you like operating. I kind of like one-to-one better, and teaching and mentoring graduate students. I love that more than anything in the world. And there's opportunities for that. There's doctoral consortiums at a lot of major conferences where you get a chance to do that. And some people are much more group folks, and they can mentor by attaching themselves to existing groups like Scouts or local chapters or affinity groups or such as that. Being advisors to the group, helping friend programs and all. But as a retiree who doesn't want to be in charge of anything anymore, I can be visible, which I think is more being a role model. But I think it's important to be accessible, to be a mentor, so that people know, particularly if you operate one-on-one, that they've got to be able to get over the first hurdle and talking to you and not being scary. Someone stood up at a VR conference and said, I challenge all the people who were over 45 or 50 or whatever his number was, is go and talk to some young people. He said, because they have accused us of not talking to them. So boy, did that hit home. Even that's as simple as hanging around after talks and just being accessible to people. Other things that I think I try to do, including doing this today, is you can mentor by accepting to be on panels and give talks. This is one. Another thing is to be on kitchen cabinets to less experienced people who are new to leadership roles. Perhaps they're on committees that you used to be in charge of, and they need to know they can call you if they have a problem. And be available to working leaders who get themselves in an emergency and need help. One of the things that my friends in VR know is that if there's ever a need for a last minute review, they can call me. So, there's how can you help? How can you do it from behind the scenes? How can you be visible enough and accessible enough to get the initial relationships that start a mentoring relationship?
Well, I will repeat that some of, Mary, you, even without doing all of that, and all of us are mentors, whether we understand that to be or not. And those are really good. Asking people to go talk to young people is really important, because I think we forget about that or think that our voices aren't important anymore. And that's not true. Maureen?
Working to unmute.
There you go.
Yeah, I don't have strong mentorships and mentors, people that like Max, I would call up and say, help me figure out this decision at all. I got it much more through the community of people I worked with, people like you all. And so you had kind of two questions going, one about the role of SIGGRAPH in your career and the other one about mentorship. So I'll try to weave them together a bit. So I discovered graphics through computer graphics through Jim Blinn, who was teaching at Caltech the year I was there, 77 to 78. And I went to my first SIGGRAPH conference in 78. I had already joined Xerox park at that point, but, and Jim just introduced me to everyone. You know who Jim Lynn is at the conference, right? He's the guy with a million ribbons. He's the guy everybody knows. And so it was a fantastic way to get an introduction to everyone in the SIGGRAPH community. My video has gone
Oh,
away.
there you go.
I didn't do that.
Well,
Let me
there you
start
go.
it back up again.
Doesn't want you to come back on, Maureen. Maybe just keep talking, and
No, I don't understand.
it's so strange. Well,
Yeah, I don't know. I could leave and come back in and you could edit that part out.
okay, well, why don't you do that?
And I'll be right back.
Okay, yes, we'll just the post, right? They'll fix it in post. That's what they say.
I hope so.
There we go. So Maureen actually is weaving the two things together, because I think for all of us, the SIGGRAPH community has been the source of many of our mentors, whether they're just around graphics, but also, as you say, Rebecca, for personal reasons, and Maxine, when even your parents know about Jim George, that he's a mentor.
So
I want to say something later about me being a mentor.
Yes, I'll get.
While Maureen's trying to log in, I'll just tell one funny Jim Blinn story. In 92, I think it was, I made him a ribbon. I hugged Jim Blinn.
I remember
I remember that.
And
I remember that.
I'm talking about we should talk to young people. I gave him a box of 500 ribbons on Sunday night or Monday night, and he came back to me 2 hours later and asked for another box.
Oh my
I
God.
only made the one box. And the other thing I liked is one of our students, John Hart, was sporting the ribbon. So I love that Jim didn't care who he hugged, and boys, girls, didn't matter. And so, yeah, I gave him that.
Well, and actually, just when you say that, Maxine, when Mary was talking about people being afraid to come to you, I think Jim is such a figure, you know, almost a legend, that a lot of people would be afraid or intimidated, but he's just not scary at all, and you know, would talk to anyone or hug anyone, to your point. And so that to me is the essence of a mentor, you know, someone who's willing, is just open to that conversation. And Maureen, you were talking about SIGGRAPH community.
But may I tell
Yes.
another Jim Blinn story?
Oh, good. This will be.
We're going to tell too many Jim
No,
Blinns.
it was a interactive 3D graphics conference in Monterey, and there were 5 or 6 of our second year, third year graduate students from Carolina, and they all said, "Mary, introduce us to somebody famous." And I said, "Okay." So I went over to Jim and I said, "The guys would like to meet somebody famous. Come over and I'll introduce you to these 4 or 5 guys who are the co-authors of this paper." We went over there and they were all speechless. No one said anything. It was a hoot. I said, "Oh, well, you've met him."
Do you think they feel that way about any of us? I hope not.
Okay.
Sorry, Maureen. I'm glad you're back. We can see you.
Thank you. So anyway, I got, you know, immediately kind of immersed in the community of SIGGRAPH because I came with Jim, right? It's different if you just kind of came in by yourself and didn't know anybody. And I could tell right then that SIGGRAPH was going to be really important to me and my career, that my career was to get a paper into SIGGRAPH, which I did in 1980. And in 1981, I got hauled out to North Carolina at the last minute to be on the papers committee because John Warnock, had appendicitis. And I was working with him at Park, and he sent me as his proxy. And that just catapulted me into the whole, you know, organization of SIGGRAPH. I met John and Kelly there. I, you know, got very interested in being part of the reviewing process. And so I eventually became a member of the papers committees, and then got kind of frustrated with how that was being managed. And I went to Jim Thomas and I said, "I want to be your papers chair. I want to fix this." And And he was a little startled that I had approached him as opposed to him picking someone else, I think. But Jim was great. And Jim Thomas was another person who was very influential in terms of people that I connected with and taught me things, as was John Beatty, as was Kelly Booth, as was Bill Cowan. But within the SIGGRAPH org, I really do remember the women a lot more. We had you, Adele, I remember, and Cindy. You know, as we were putting that conference together, who was getting the work done? You know?
Yeah.
And yeah, I was trying to prep for this to try to remember when I met everyone, and I just can't. But you know, Max, I know I had bumped into you by then. Mary, I don't know if I'd bumped into you until after I went to Waterloo on sabbatical and learned about them sending you roses to get frame buffers in a timely manner. But you know,
There's a story.
There's always a story.
there's always a story. Certainly at the Detroit conference at the graphics lab, the Waterloo graphics lab was running. I remember running around with you, Adele, as you were getting stuff done.
Oh God, that was a long
And
time
in
ago.
1990, I was pregnant with my first son, and you guys threw me a baby shower at the conference. And that was so awesome. I mean, I was just overwhelmed, you know. And so, yeah, my career in the first half of my career was all SIGGRAPH. A bit of the Color Imaging Society as I got into the work with Beatty and Bill Cowan in 86, 85, 86, doing display to print work. And then we took that into SIGGRAPH to do all the covers for several years after 87 when I was papers chair. And after that, I got onto the executive committee for a while. And shortly after that, got recruited for CGNA, I think. That was maybe a little later. But yeah, it was kind of how I was driving my career, was around SIGGRAPH. And then I switched, you know, over time back into the visualization community. And so IEEE Viz has been my primary conference for at least the last decade, if not a bit more. But I've never, you know, I've stayed a member of the Pioneers. I've gone to the SIGGRAPH when it was close by, and certainly remember it fondly, and so many learnings from the people in the community there. Both
So I think
how to drive a technical career and how to drive a technical community like SIGGRAPH.
I think what we've all said here, and a message to people, to the women listening to this, or the people listening to this, it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, is that SIGGRAPH is a community that's more than just a group of people putting on a conference, but can really, if you allow it to happen, become your community, both professionally and personally. It's almost hard not to. In fact, I think you'd have to try really hard not to get involved, as Rebecca said, you know, with people who become your friends, and they know what's happening in your life, and for people to take advantage of that, to understand that it's more than just a group of people going to a conference. So I'm watching my watch to see how much time we have, and maybe this will also be a question about mentors, but one of the things I wanted to ask was, what do you consider to be the most satisfying thing you've ever done with SIGGRAPH? And I'm going to go back to you, Maxine.
Well, so I want to first talk about mentors and then briefly talk about satisfying things. But so you asked if we were mentors. At my lab, so it was a visualization lab, a computer graphics lab at the electronic visualization lab. I was like mom. Then a couple years ago, I was grandmom, but I was mom for many of those years. And I would help them with their resumes. I would talk to them. I mean, I could read their faces or their behavior. You're sad, you're upset, you know, or what's going on. So, but in 1998, I found out that I was going to get the first Outstanding Service Award from SIGGRAPH. At that time, National Science Foundation had just funded the lab to do international networking. They really liked the fact that with networking, if you stream a movie, and in those days we were streaming on megabit baby networks and with scientific huge images, you can tell real fast if the network's working or not. And, you know, just think of a bad night with Netflix, but this is pre-Netflix, pre-everything. And so the National Science Foundation got us involved with networking for that reason. We were users of the network and we could prove whether it worked or not. And they said it's very important for us to go to this international networking conference that was in Geneva, sponsored by the Internet Society. It's called INET, is the same week as SIGGRAPH, and I was supposed to get an award. And so I contacted SIGGRAPH and I said, look, can I make a videotape, an acceptance speech, and I'll have one of my students accept the award for me. And they said, okay. So I did a video at the lab and it was shown. And then when they called someone up, what had happened is when my students got to the conference, they told the alumni, and 35 people went up to the stage to accept my award. So here's a photograph that was sent to me. And these are all the students. It's faded, but right here is my student that I had asked to pick up the award, and she's holding it high. But I had 35 students and they all started wearing this ribbon.
Ooh.
And I don't know where it came from. I don't know. I mean, they asked obviously SIGGRAPH to make this, but they all sported this ribbon and gave me one, which was in my scrapbook. So I just wanted to tell that.
Oh,
story.
that's fabulous, Maxine. And I was at SIGGRAPH. I don't remember that because I would have had one of those ribbons if I had known about it.
I have no idea where it came from. I just wanted one student to go up and accept the award, and that was it. Anyway, so as far as your question about what was my most satisfying contribution, so the short answer, I thought about this for a long time, and I had said last panel that I thought being editor of this report was very important. But then I realized this report, it wasn't that the report itself would never have been seen by the public. It was sponsored by National Science Foundation. They would have put it in a file drawer to collect dust. SIGGRAPH published it, and SIGGRAPH sent it to its membership. So then I realized that talking in modern language, my most satisfying contribution is that I helped make SIGGRAPH a platform on which influencers could promote. And by influencers, you know, today they blog and it's all about ideology. We promoted innovation, we promoted communities, and we disseminated information. And without our newsletter and without that platform for finding people and bringing them together, SIGGRAPH provided that to the computer graphics industry. And if you think about the art show, and I had nothing to do with the art show, but art was not, or computers were not accepted by the traditional art community as a medium. Artists found out about SIGGRAPH, and SIGGRAPH showed their work until it was obvious that computers are a medium for making art. And I started the education committee by putting an ad in the newsletter saying, this movie Tron just came out, and I, as SIGGRAPH secretary, was getting 1 million letters. How do I get into this field? Where do I go to school? And, you know, I just couldn't answer all these letters, and I didn't know the answers. And so I put an ad, and Steve Cunningham and Judy Brown showed up at the first meeting with 50 other people, and we had an education committee. And the slide sets, the SIGGRAPH video review, they all came out before Foley and Van Dam's first official textbook on the subject. I mean, we created educational materials for the classroom, and they were still used. I mean, you can have a textbook, but you still need the visuals. So I think my biggest contribution now is helping make SIGGRAPH that platform.
Well, no wonder you got that award, Maxine. And it was no wonder you got the first one, which
Well, Jim George, he happened to be in charge of the awards committee, but it was committee. It wasn't, I mean, he didn't make the decision.
To fix
We're
wasn't
not
in.
accusing, we're not accusing.
They had a list of people, but I had done more different things.
Yeah.
And so he says, it was eeny, meeny, miny, mo, but the fact that I had a varied list versus other people who had more specific things. But then he fought the executive committee too, because they wanted to give out the outstanding service award. The committee wanted to do it every year because there was a lot of people that deserved that award. This was 1998. SIGGRAPH started in 1974. And they said, no, you can't do it every year. It's every other year. So, I mean, they had a list and they just succeeded in going through the list.
Well, that's a lot that you've done. That's still, I mean, somewhere I still have slide sets in the closet behind me.
Well, Steve Levine did the slide sets, but I did help with the documentation.
Right.
And so I didn't do everything,
No,
but that newsletter was a platform for promoting them, advertising them, and I wrote lots of articles for that newsletter as secretary.
Right.
So I just realized that without this is important, but if SIGGRAPH didn't publish it, it would be nowhere.
Well, thank you for all of that,
Okay.
Max. Rebecca, what about you?
I mean, it's kind of a cheater answer because there were so many like micro satisfying moments while conference chair, but I think serving as conference chair in 2012, the lead up to it, all the planning. I mean, there were hard spots where I'm like, I don't think I can do this. I had to get talked down quite a bit. I think a lot of conference chairs do, maybe all of us. But looking back and during the conference week where I didn't really have much to do, like you pick the right people, you aim them in the right direction, and then they get to do all the stuff. And just watching it all unfold was really exciting. Like, I just remember being like at the reception, like, like, you did it. It was like the coolest thing, like every little thing that we've been talking about for years. And it just like materialized despite like the Mars rover landed, like all the things happened the way they were supposed to. And it was, and we also didn't lose money. Like the icing, was just like financially it was stable and strong attendance, all the things that we measure the success by. And simultaneously having like a wee little toddler running around the convention center with me, like it all, it's pretty great to think about it now that it all worked out, despite like a bazillion emails and conference calls and all the things we had to do to get it there. But it was pretty great. I mean, there's not a lot of us, right? The group of us who have done it. And it's a pretty massive undertaking to get through it unscathed, to get through it and say, I'm glad I did it, is very satisfying for sure.
Tom DeFonte told me after SIGGRAPH 88 that nothing would ever intimidate me again. And he's pretty spot on. The only person that ever intimidated me after that was Stephen Hawking, but he's in a whole other world, right? But I remember Tom saying that. And I mean, that's 35 years ago, and I still remember him saying that. Mary, you weren't a conference chair, but you chaired the organization, which was a whole other thing. But that you may not count that as your best accomplishment. I don't know.
I think that while I was chair, and it was another one of those times, actually, I had a command performance with, I think, 6 people from ACM headquarters. I had been chair for 6 hours, and they said, "You're $1 million in debt." Okay. There was an accounting problem. Old video reviews are not the same as cash. They lose their value. So we were $1 million in the hole. And we didn't know, this was we'd been growing through the 80s, and it was clearly on a trajectory to get large and very important. And we didn't have a plan. I went to the ACM and I said, we would like permission to spend I think it was all of $70,000, which was a lot of money in 1994, to have a planning retreat for 2 or 3 days. We went to Snowbird. Actually, I don't know how many of us there were, 50 to 75 maybe. And out of that, we did a getting to common ground method of trying to agree on some goals. And we came out of there with 6 areas of planning for the organization. And when I look back, we made progress in each of those 6, and the goals that were set during that meeting really carried the organization for about 10 years. And I'm really quite proud of that. And, it's again, I was sort of in the background, but, and it sounds kind of quaint, SIGGRAPH in the 21st century. And that sounds quaint today, but it was a very serious conversation that we needed to have then. And, we make those again. And then 93 and 94 made money, so we got out of the hole. I think I ran my first history, Birds of a Feather, in either 2006 or 2008. So I've been at the history thing for a long time. I pestered the EC long enough, and Jessica Hodgins said, oh my, the 50th is coming up upon us. And the history committee was formalized as a standing committee in about 5 years ago. We've done 2 things that I think are particularly good for this year. There is a special issue of Computer Graphics and Applications that has 200 plus memories of SIGGRAPH that were submitted by attendees. And it's a great fun read. And if the history committee, if one of our jobs is collecting stories, we did it in spades this year. And the other thing is really celebrating our technical history and publishing the 2nd volume of the seminal graphics papers. So there are 88 papers in the 2nd volume, and it should hit the digital library sometime this week. And thanks to IEEE and to ACM, all of that material, the CG&A and the 2 volumes of the seminal papers will be free to download. And I'm quite pleased with those accomplishments as well.
As you should be. Maureen.
Well, it all centers around SIGGRAPH 1987 when I was the papers chair. Now, SIGGRAPH had started, of course, as a small technical conference in a very tight community, starting in the 70s and up and through the early 80s. But by the mid 80s, the papers selection in particular was being done fairly informally still. And people were complaining that, only the insiders could get papers in SIGGRAPH. And there was at least that kind of feel. And then there was, oh my gosh, there's too many papers. We've rendered X for a certain value of X. And they get in, and papers in other areas, especially, we're still supposed to be an interaction conference. We're still supposed to be graphics for something other than Hollywood, right? And the way the selection had been done was still fairly informal, it felt to me. I mean, yes, you got multiple reviewers, but there wasn't the blind reviewing. There wasn't, it was way too easy for it to feel uneven and opaque. And so I said, well, I've got a bunch of ideas how I could fix that. And that's what inspired me to volunteer to be the 87 papers chair. And I got a lot of support from Jim Thomas and the 87 committee to really redo things. We made it a day and a half instead of just 1 day. We started involving more people in the critical distribution of the papers out to the committee. But one thing that I did that was I was extremely proud of is I wrote a very detailed, how does your SIGGRAPH paper get reviewed? What can you do to help make it easier for you to get your paper into SIGGRAPH? And made that the instructions for authors. Sorry, this is Rory. And I feel that just really helped. And we had a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful set of papers at the 87 conference. And that set of instructions and that format, which was you get a bunch of senior people to help the papers chair divide up the papers to the right reviewers. You spend the extra day or half day to be sure that there's enough time previously than cramming it into a day. And it was like, okay, we just got to get through these last papers. I mean, to me, that was something that definitely needed to be fixed, because the papers were the part of the conference that I really cared about. And I thought really wanted to see them have quality, clearly unbiased viewing. I mean, these are no accusations to the previous people. It's just that without a clear process, it gets messy. And sometimes you just have to set that up. And so having done all of that and worked really hard, and that was the year that we accepted the ray tracing Jello paper. That actually wasn't a hard decision. I sent it out to the committee so that it went through formal review like anything else, although I did make all the reviewers just members of the committee. And you stack rank the papers by their grades, you know, it was at the top. So a more challenging one was John Lasseter's paper about character animation for 3D graphics. And I had to fight a battle with some of my other reviewers about senior committee members about whether that was appropriate for SIGGRAPH, because it wasn't technical.
Oh.
Wasn't technical enough. You can take that part out. But I felt very strongly that the storytelling, you know, was important, and what he had to say was important. And I think, you know, it's a seminal paper. So we had a bunch of seminal papers out of that year. So when you see an org, you know, on the path, this happens to all orgs, right? They are small, and then they grow, and then they need kind of a bit of a reset about how to be a little more formal, and then press on, you know, for the next decade. I feel like I was part of that. And then, of course, the whole 87 conference, I think, was very successful. And we were talking about community and mentorship. And I think Jim Thomas certainly helped, but, you know, we had a great team of people running the conference. We had tremendous amount of fun together. It was a Disneyland year, so we got to even go do some Disneyland things together. Me and Sarah Bly and Mike Bailey I was papers, she was panels, and
He was courses.
Courses.
Yes, he was courses.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you for saving me through my senior moment there.
It's okay. We all have to save each other. That's what community's for.
We got little hats, sailor hats, that they embroider at Disneyland that said papers, panels, and courses. And we wore them at some internal event. It was great. So anyway, I think of that as being probably one of my primary contributions. I did something similar with CG&A when I took over as theme issues chair, whatever they called it, associate editor-in-chief. I helped us really understand what it took to put together a good theme issue, to get the right people to lead it, I made a visualization of the timeline, which people were having trouble seeing because you've got all these overlapping things. So it was very clear when stuff needed to get done and how it needed to get done. And once again, once you kind of set it up, you set up the framework, you get some good people going on it, then it just really takes off. So, I mean, I've also spent a bunch of my life as a corporate manager, both at Tableau and a little bit at Park. And, you know, that's one of the reasons I was willing to take on managerial duties for, you know, both the people, the opportunity. It's interesting, you're not supposed to call it mentoring. You don't mentor people that work for you. A mentorship relationship is an actual personal relationship with somebody who has not got power over you. As they teach you to be a good manager, you know, you should not expect those personal connections with the people. I mean, they're great if they happen, But your job is to make it work even if they don't happen in terms of them succeeding at their career. But what really inspires them are the people that they text when they're frantic. It may not be you. That's fine.
Well, I think what we
Anyway,
have here is a group of people who got things done, who moved the
That's-
organization forward in
Yes.
different ways, you know, everything from PR and communications and education to the technical papers to history to those of us. And I'll tell you mine, and which is so arcane that only a few people would know it. There was an argument that SIGGRAPH should not go to Los Angeles. It should always be in San Francisco if it was on the West Coast, because that was the heart of Silicon Valley. And I was in charge of site selection. And I pushed for it to go to LA. And it was such a huge success. Now it's an issue if it's not in LA every other year. But I pushed really hard for that. And that's a weird thing to be proud of. But every time I see the conference has gone to LA, I think, if we hadn't have pushed that, if I hadn't have, and I probably somewhere still bear the scar email from people who thought that it was a crazy thing. But anyway, we're going to end this now, but I want to thank all of you for your time, especially as some of us are getting ready to go to SIGGRAPH. Some of us are unpacking a house and getting ready to move into a new community. I'm going to share my screen again so that I can thank you all properly. Boy, I love sharing. So again, thanks to all of our panelists who we've gotten to know over this conversation, and thanks to Autodesk Foundry for the sponsorship, and thanks to all of you who have who will be watching this and are watching it now. And I'll see you all at SIGGRAPH, except for you, Rebecca. But
It's okay. Hug everybody for me.
thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.